Greetings and welcome to a band summary. This week we are going to be covering the greatest heavy metal / rock and roll band of all times. You guessed it, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin originated in London, England. As I said, the genre was heavy metal / rock and roll. Their manager was Peter Grant. They started out with Atlantic Records, and they were active from 1968 to 1980. That was the band. Their members were Jimmy Page, who was the lead guitarist, Robert Plant, who was the vocalist, John Paul Jones was their bassist, and then John Bonham was their drummer. Now that we got some statistics out of the way, let's go into their history. Jimmy Page is actually the founding member of Led Zeppelin. He originally joined a group called the Yardbirds in 1966, and he heavily contributed to this already established band. He contributed to their last album, Little Games. After Little Games was released, they toured, but then right after that, the lead vocalist and the drummer left. They didn't want anything to do with the Yardbirds anymore, so it was just Jimmy Page and the bassist at the time. And little side note, a little foreshadowing, on the album Little Games, they actually called in John Paul Jones to do a little work on that project. So that kind of comes back later because John later said, oh, I really want to work with Jimmy Page if I have the opportunity in the future. If the opportunity arises. Spoiler, it arises, but we'll get to that point later. Originally, Jimmy Page had picked out his ideal vocalist and drummer, but neither of his first picks could make it, but they each recommended somebody. The vocalist recommended Robert Plant, and after hearing him sing, Jimmy said, yes, I want this person to be in the band. Same thing with John Bonham. After they were hired onto the new Yardbirds, which is what they were going to be calling themselves, the original bassist just decided he wasn't quite happy with the selection. I don't exactly know why he left, but the bassist left. So then John Paul Jones comes in, he's like, hey man, remember me from that album that we worked on together? Yeah, you wanna do it again? Yeah, sure man, let's do that. So they did. I'm sure that's exactly how it went down. The Yardbirds, or the new Yardbirds, had some touring obligations that they had to do. And so they went on tour with none of the original members. They're basically a cover band at that point, which is just kind of funny considering everything that happens. I'm sure that the people who went to see those concerts live for the Yardbirds tour, they were like, oh man, none of the original members were there. But then imagine the bragging rights later of, oh, we saw Led Zeppelin in their earliest phase. How cool would that be? So they fulfilled, it was a Scandinavian tour, and the Yardbirds fulfilled that, and they were going to continue under the new Yardbirds name. But turns out that Jimmy Page, since he wasn't one of the founding members, didn't actually own the name, the new Yardbirds or the Yardbirds. The bassist who left when the other members were hired was like, oh, I actually own that name. So they renamed themselves Led Zeppelin. Apparently the name was based off of a joke that somebody made when Little Games was being recorded. They were like, oh yeah, we're working really well together. And then they were like, oh haha, if we actually pursued this, it would go down like a lead balloon. So apparently they thought it was funny and just decided the irony was too good to pass up. So, thus, Led Zeppelin was born. So, under their new name, they got to work and they recorded their first album, Zeppelin 1, in under 30 hours. If that doesn't say anything about their later success, then I don't know what does. After it was released in 1969, it was a huge hit all around the world. So they toured after their first album, they recorded Zeppelin 2, huge hit. They toured after that, and the third one, they rented a nice little cottage out in the country, and they were going to write their heavy metal, new sound, rock and roll, heavy metal music, but instead they came out with more of an acoustic album, which I'm sure the cottage had something to do with it. Although people were a little bit surprised at their softer sound and more acoustic, folky vibe of the whole album, it reached #1 in the United States and the United Kingdom. This is 1970. 1971 was Zeppelin 4 when they released it. They toured after that. And then in 1973, they released Houses of the Holy. 1974 was kind of quiet, only because they were, creating their own record label, Swan Song. And then in 1975, they released Physical Graffiti from Swan Song. When they were about to go on the American leg of the Physical Graffiti tour, Robert Plant was actually in a pretty serious car accident with his wife, and they were unable to finish their tour. They spent the rest of 1976 writing while Robert Plant was recovering, and in 1976 they released Presence. That tour was also cut short because Robert Plant, again, he had his son passed away from a disease, and he had to go home, and then they spent the rest of that year recovering. It wasn't until 1979 whenever they released In Through the Outdoor, and then they were going to be on tour in 1980, and as they were about to go on the American leg of the tour, unfortunately they found that John Bonham had passed away. He had been a raging alcoholic for a while up until this point, and apparently he had taken the equivalent of 40 shots of vodka, and he asphyxiated in his sleep. They ended up having to cancel their last tour, and then they disbanded shortly after. They were active for 12 years, the greatest rock and roll / heavy metal band ever, had 8 studio albums. They only had 8. That's it. After they disbanded, they came together for a couple live performances in 1985. There was a Live Aid benefit in 1988, Atlantic Records 40th anniversary concert, 1995, the band's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and then they did a full-blown concert in London in 2007 to honor Atlantic's co-founder. With that live show, they got John Bonham's son to play for him. I read an interview with Jimmy Page on why they didn't just try to replace the drummer, and he was basically like, the magic was gone by that point. Like, they knew that what they had was so special and so tight, and then if they tried to replace someone, it just wouldn't be the same. And as I said before, I think that adds to their legend in a way, because they ended when they were at the top. Like, people were just wanting their music, more and more of it, and then they just ended while they were on top, and they never finished their story. But in that case also, you never saw them like go downhill or release a bad album or start fighting amongst themselves. Their live performances were apparently out of this world. They had a larger than life vibe about them, and it just drew people in. Some of their signature moves, as I said before, they would have long solos. Apparently John Bonham during Moby Dick would do a 30-minute drum solo. It's very long in the record itself, or in the song itself. It's just very long, but live he would just keep going. And Jimmy Page would, he did this in their albums, but he would also in live bring out a violin bow and he would play on his guitar. And then after the solo had gone on long enough and the group had collectively, with their collective mindset, had decided it had gone on long enough, or it was ready to kind of kick it back in, they would just, boom, so tight, very, very tight. And the thing is, each of them individually were a master of their craft. All of them. And to combine that together was just phenomenal. Contribution to music overall. They completely pioneered and created the sound for heavy metal and expanded the rock and roll genre and what it could actually be. Because you go from tame guitar bands. The most risky topic is from the Rolling Stones song, Let's Spend the Night Together. And then you have this bold sound and these people who live like free rock stars, and they put certain things in their music that hadn't been done before. I wasn't expecting that. You always have to think about the context of whenever things happen. And people's mindset on a whole, in comparison to today, was still quite conservative. And then you go completely 180 to this group that is apparently like dark magic based, and they sold their souls to the devil for fame and fortune. Jimmy Page did have an interest in dark magic, just curious about things and how people do things, but he admitted, he's just like, no, like we didn't sell our souls to the devil. Of course, that's what they would say. But it wasn't like today where you hear a rumor about someone and then in the same hour you can, like, a new interview will be released with that person of, oh, like this person like addressing this statement that was made about them. It wasn't like that. It was the 70s. The internet wasn't exactly a thing at the time. So really, you just had this speculation and mystery, rumor, conspiracies. And it's interesting at the time, especially considering what had been leading up to that point. It was very new and unheard of for things like that. I think that Led Zeppelin came at the exact moment that they needed to come in order to get their success. If they had decided to form their group and do exactly what it is that they were doing 10 years prior, I'm not sure the world would have been ready for them in their full potential. So this is just pure speculation, but I have a feeling that they would not have been as successful or as well known as they were if they had come like 10 years prior or even 10 years after, because it was at a pinnacle moment in world history and they were right there when they needed to be. Alright, here is their discography. I know I went through it earlier, but it's nice to see it all written out on the screen. According to some sources, their most famous album was Zeppelin 4. And according to also some sources, their most popular song, or their best song, is A Whole Lotta Love. Now, of course, whenever most people think of Led Zeppelin, the one song that comes to mind, Stairway to Heaven, of course. I mean, it's a phenomenal song, it's amazing, and it's one of my personal favorites. I also really like, oh man, it's so hard to pick a favorite song because they're all so good and they're all so different. But I really liked Moby Dick, although the drum solo, a little bit excessive, but I like drums, they're very nice. So my overall take of the band is they're the greatest rock and roll band of all times. And it's not just because, if I want to be respected as a musician, that I'm legally bound to say that. I actually do think that they are the greatest rock and roll / heavy metal band of all times. And to be honest, I wasn't really a big fan of their music before I decided to do this research because I just didn't quite understand it and I just didn't really want to listen to them, but I forced myself. I sat down with their albums, all of them. I listened to all of their albums, every song. And the more I listened to them, the more I liked them. And the more I wanted to listen to them. I see now why they are so revered. And I am definitely a fan now. Anyway, what do you think? Have you listened to the Led Zeppelin albums or any songs? Which one's your favorite? What album's your favorite? Did you see them live? I have all these questions. Is there anything of importance that I missed that you think should have been in this video? Let me know in the comments. Let's start a conversation and let's further this knowledge. Thank you so much for watching, and if there's any particular bands that you would like to see, let me know in the comments. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. So long.